video, we're going to look at interval notation of inequalities. Okay, so the first thing we want to get down is, remember when we're doing an inequality and we're graphing it, we have a closed circle, which remember is shaded. Then we have an open circle that is obviously open. It's not shaded. And that the closed circle goes with less than or equal to or greater than or equal to. Okay, I always remember it like a line under it means shaded. So no line means no shading. So less than or greater than goes with open. Now we're going to actually take that same concept and apply it to interval notation. Because when we write interval notation, here's what interval notation basically is. It's essentially it's a way to write the solution. So way to write solution. It's a way to write a solution for our inequality. Okay, so what we're going to do though is we're going to use parentheses and brackets to write those answers. Okay, now parentheses is for open circles, or once again it can be an open circle or less than or greater than. And then a bracket, you could probably figure out, goes with a closed circle. So closed, or it's going to be shaded in, or once again, if you say greater than or equal to or less than or equal to. Well, I said that backwards. Less than or equal to or greater than or equal to. All right? Now, here's how this works. We'll look at some examples, but this is kind of the initial part, or this is the initial part. It's not really kind of. This is the initial part of what we need to get down. So somewhere, somehow, memorize parentheses means open. Brackets means mean close. All right, so now let's just look at a few easy examples, and then we'll actually look at some compound examples. So let's say I have x greater than or equal to 8. Now, I'm going to show you the graph because typically you do both of these at the same time, but occasionally you don't. So I'll just show you what it looks like with a graph just so you can see it. So let's say we have a couple points here. We don't really need that many. We'll say this is, we'll say that's 8. We'll say this is 9. This is 7, 6, and so on. All right. Now, if we were to graph this inequality, x is greater than or equal to 8, we would put a closed circle or a shaded circle at 8 because our inequality has a line under it, or it's greater than or equal to. And then greater than means all the values to the right are going to be my answers. Now, when I'm writing interval notation, what you're going to do, just to make your life easy, you're going to act like you're reading this number line like it's a sentence. So you're going to read it from the left to the right. Okay? Now, if this graph were to keep going all the way to the left and it just kept going over here, eventually we would get into such complicated numbers that we would call this all the way to the left negative infinity. Okay? Infinity is not a number. It just stands for a really, really big number. So if we go all the way to the left, that's approaching negative infinity. If we go all the way to the right, same thing, except we're increasing, so we're approaching positive infinity. Now, the reason I say that is because if we read this from left to right, we want to use what we're reading to help us with our interval notation. So when I look all the way to the left, is my graph pointing towards negative infinity? Or what I'm really asking is any of my graph even over here to the left of 8? No, none of my graph is over to the left of 8, or it's beside, well, the easiest way to explain it would be nothing is to the left of 8, which means 8 is our actual start point. So the first thing we're going to do is write 8 for our interval notation. Now, this kind of looks like an ordered pair, but don't get it confused with an ordered pair. This is interval notation rather than an ordered pair. So if we're starting at 8, the first thing I have to decide is, should 8 get a parentheses or should 8 get a bracket? And if my circle is shaded, or if this is greater than or equal to, then I'm going to use a bracket. Now, the next part is, where am I, if I start at 8, where am I actually heading towards? What am I approaching? Well, if I'm going to values greater than 8, I'm moving to the right of 8, which is actually going to point towards infinity. Because basically, if I say, hey, what are all the numbers greater than 8? You basically could just name up to a trillion, a billion, whatever, until you ran out of numbers to even use. That's what infinity stands for. And if I told you, once again, to count from 8 to, I don't know, greater than 8, you would just count forever. So we call that infinity. So this interval is actually going from 8 to infinity. And here's the thing about infinity. Since infinity is not a real number, it always gets a parentheses. So never use a bracket for infinity or negative infinity. All right, let's do another one of these to try to get some understanding. Because at first it's a little complicated, but it gets easier. So let's try, let's say I gave you x less than -1. Once again, I'll graph it for you because the graph is actually easier to visualize. If I just start saying what the answer is without a visual, in my experience, it is hard to read or hard to visualize. All right, so now, once again, let's just act like we're graphing this. We're going to put an open circle at -1, and then if x is less than -1, we're going to be moving to the left. So now, once again, a little trick you can help or use to help yourself out. If we were to just head to the left and never stop, that's negative infinity. That's approaching negative infinity. If we were to head to the right and never stop, that's approaching positive infinity. So I want to figure out, okay, from left to right, what am I actually reading while I'm looking at this graph from left to right? If I start all the way over here to the left, is my graph actually going towards the left? Yeah, it is. So technically, we're going to call negative infinity our start point, okay? Because we're acting like we're moving from the left to the right, and if I start at negative infinity, my graph's actually pointing that way, so that means negative infinity is my start point. I probably should word that better. If I'm pointing towards negative infinity or to the left, then negative infinity is my start point. That's a better way to phrase it. All right, now, that's going to get a parentheses because, once again, negative infinity is technically not a number. So how do you make a number that doesn't exist closed? You can't. So negative infinity and positive infinity always get a parentheses. But now we're going to head over, once again, from left to right. And now our end point, or the right side boundary, is -1. Because if you notice, this graph stops at -1 and it doesn't go any further to the right. So -1 is my upper bound, my bound to the right. So now you have to use this open circle or this less than symbol to tell you if this gets a parentheses or a bracket. And it would get a parentheses because -1 is not included in our solution. All right, let's just do one more quick one like this, and then we'll look at compound inequalities. All right, so let's say I give you, let me find one. Let's say p is greater than 0. Okay? So once again, here's the number line. I could start at 0. I could say this is 1, this is 2. This is -1, -2. All right, now, if I graph this, I'm going to make an open circle at 0 because this inequality means open. And then greater than means to the right. So once again, let's do the interval notation. From left to right, where does this graph actually start? Am I starting at negative infinity or am I starting at 0? Well, I'm starting at 0. If you notice, I'm starting at 0 and moving all the way to the right towards infinity. So my interval notation is basically going to say, okay, I'm moving from 0 to infinity, and then I just need to fill in if it's a bracket or a parentheses for 0 and infinity. So what about 0? Would that get a bracket or parentheses? It would be a parentheses because this is an open circle. Infinity always gets a parentheses because you can't close in a number that doesn't exist. All right, so now let's go to something a little bit different. Let's look at compound inequalities. So when we look at compound inequalities, we're actually going to do the same process. It's just going to look a little bit different. So let me show you. X less than or equal to 2 or x greater than 9. All right, so now I'll give you another graph and we'll put up a couple points here. We'll say this is 2, this is 1. We'll say somewhere over here there's a bunch of points in the middle, somewhere over here is 9, and then 10. That way we don't have to make this super complicated. All right, so now let's graph this. If you remember, or if you haven't even learned this yet, go back and look at some of the videos I've already posted, and you'll find compound inequality graphing. When there's an or, essentially it means we're going to have a point at 2 and a point at 9, and those arrows are going to point away from each other. Now, 2 is actually going to be closed, it's going to be shaded in, and 9 is just greater than, so that's going to be open. And then the arrows are going to point away from each other, which if you read the actual inequality, it makes sense. If x is less than 2, then it should go to the left. If x is greater than 9, it should go to the right. Now, here's the issue. Let's do each of these individually. Like, you just tell me the interval notation for this side. So let's just start with the x less than or equal to 2. Okay, so if I look at this from left to right, my x values are pointing towards negative infinity. So I'm going to start at negative infinity, and then where do I stop? I stop right here at 2. I'm going from negative infinity to 2. That's my interval. Negative infinity gets a parentheses. 2 is shaded in or closed, so it gets a bracket. All right, now let's do the other side. Let's do x is greater than 9. So mentally block out everything else except this part of the graph. Now, if I look at this right side of my graph, I'm going from 9, that's my actual start point, and I'm pointing towards infinity. I almost wrote negative infinity. So I'm going towards infinity. Now, if I'm moving from 9 to infinity, I just need to fill in the gaps, which are bracket or parentheses around 9. Well, this is an open circle. This is just greater than, so that gets a parentheses. So does infinity. Now, the issue is there's a gap in between here. Here's how you fill in that gap using interval notation. You just put a big U in the middle, and that covers the gap. That's actually called a union symbol. But for the sake of keeping this simple, you just have to put a big U in the middle, and it essentially joins both of these parts of your graph. Okay, let's do another one, because I know maybe that was a little weird. Let's do another one, and then we'll look at and then we'll be finished. All right, so now let's say I have n less than or equal to -1, or n is greater than 4. So real quick, let's do a little graph. We've got, I'll make it simple. Let's just say -1's here and 4's here, and there's a bunch of stuff in between. Okay, and to the right and to the left. All right, now let's look at each of these individually. So n less than or equal to -1, the graph would be a closed circle, and it would point to the left. N greater than 4 would be an open circle, and it would point to the right. So now I want to know what's the interval notation. So once again, an easy trick is to just do each of these separately, and where this gap is, we're just going to plug in a big U. All right, so now watch what happens. If n is less than or equal to -1, that means that I'm actually going to start at negative infinity and go from negative infinity to 1. So I'm going from negative infinity to -1. But that 1 needs to get a bracket because, which, let me redo that because that looks like a bracket. That is a parentheses, and then -1 gets a bracket because this is a closed circle or a closed point, whatever you want to call it. So then I'm going to put a big U in the middle to account for this gap. And then if I want to do n is greater than 4, I'm starting at 4 and approaching infinity. So I'm going to go from 4 to infinity. 4 is going to get a parenthesis since it's an open circle, and so does infinity. So that would be our answer. All right, now, probably the easiest version of this is an and inequality. Like, let's say we have something that looks like this. We could have 0 less than p less than 5. Okay? Now, just real quick, a little graph will help us see what's happening. Let's say this is 0, this is 5. There's some stuff in the middle, some stuff to the right. Don't really care. All right, now, if you remember an and inequality, you actually will have two open circles. At least for this one, you'll have two open circles, not always. But you'll have 2 points over 0 and 5. But then an and inequality, they're actually connected. They point towards each other. And since these are both less than, or I guess you could reverse it and say greater than, since there's no line under these inequalities, they're going to stay open. Now, here's what that means. If I were to look at negative infinity, there's nothing approaching this negative infinity. 0's not going towards negative infinity. It just starts at 0. So 0 is our start point. Now, where's the graph end? Well, look at 5. There's nothing going towards infinity to the right of 5. So actually, our answer is somewhere in between 0 and 5. So it's somewhere in between here, which means my interval is literally just 0 to 5. So all I have to do is say, okay, 0, comma 5. That tells me I'm going from 0 to 5. And then I just have to figure out if it's parentheses or bracket. And both of these would get parentheses. All right, let's do one more, and then we'll be finished. So just one last one. I bet you could probably do this one. Let's say 2 less than or equal to x less than or equal to 8. So once again, you may not even need the graph, but I'll do it just so you can see it. We're going to say this is 2, this is 8. There's some stuff in between, some stuff to the right and to the left. All right, now, the graph would look like this. We would say these inequalities have lines under them, so they're closed points. If x is in between 2 and 8, that means that all of this in between 2 and 8 is going to be my solution. So all of this is actually the answer or the solution to the problem, which means my interval literally goes from 2 to 8. So it doesn't go over here to negative infinity, doesn't go over here to the right to positive infinity. It's literally just 2 to 8, and your job is to know brackets or parentheses. And if both these points are closed, you would just use brackets. So hopefully that makes sense. Feel free to reach out if you need some extra help on the interval notation. But you'll get used to these. Practice is the most important thing with these. But yeah, like I said, reach out if you need me to answer any other questions.